It wasn't about what made me want to write a book, but what gave me the confidence to actually do it, knowing I wouldn't be perfect at it, knowing that, my first book probably wouldn't see the light of day, and it hasn't, and it won't.
Hello, and welcome to So I Wrote a Book, Now What? Where writers chat about writing. My guest today is Mara Williams. She writes stories about humans and the varied, troubled situations they find themselves in, usually with a happily ever after. She has some amazing things to say about her process and about the writing community, so let's get into it. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, Nicole. Great to be here. Thanks for the invite.
What made you decide to write a book?
Oh, goodness. I have been writing since I was a little kid. Really, as soon as I was able to read and write, I've been writing. In fact, this weekend we were cleaning out our garage. This is kind of embarrassing, but also really silly. And I found an entire bin of my old books I wrote on spiral notebooks.
Oh, yes.
When I was in elementary school, middle school, high school, I remember we would go, our form of family vacation was camping for a week, and there was something about the stillness of the lake, and I would bring my poor parents. I would bring an entire duffel bag of all of my notebooks, and super heavy, completely unnecessary. It's not like I was going to go in and revise. I just needed them there for reference. So I was obviously a little intense child. And so I've always wanted to be a writer, and I've always written. And I think it wasn't until much later in my life that I gained the confidence to do it, even if I wasn't going to be perfect at first. I think I had to go through some deprogramming that, I wasn't going to necessarily, I was going to have to revise, I was going to have to learn, I was going to have to really learn through doing. So it was much later, sort of after I had tried and been unable to break through. I think it was usually around the 15 to 20,000 word mark where I'd kind of get stuck because I didn't know what to write next, or I didn't know how to finish it. And I would get too much in my own heads. I really took a very long hiatus while having my family, building my career, all of that. And it was sort of, I had this moment where you start to get to a certain age and you're like, okay, if not now, when? And I don't really know what really crystallized for me, but it was also on a vacation, sort of the quiet and the stillness. And I was taking a run along the ocean, and I had a line of text that just came into my head and an idea of a character. And I just had this moment of, if not now, when? And started writing, and kind of wrote in a fever dream, really, over 3 to 4 months, and finished my first, actually wrote the end to a book about 4 months later. So, and from then it's been, I'm always drafting, I'm always writing. That was about 7 years ago now, 6 or 7 years ago. And so I've been writing more seriously and diligently ever since. So I think it wasn't about what made me want to write a book, but what gave me the confidence to actually do it, knowing I wouldn't be perfect at it, knowing that, my first book probably wouldn't see the light of day, and it hasn't, and it won't. But yeah, it was about that confidence. And I think that confidence that comes with age, that, it's not about being perfect. It's about actually trying and committing and realizing that perfection is kind of boring anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's not a really interesting epiphany moment, but it was just a moment of bravery, I think, that comes with a bit of maturity.
Yeah, there is so much bravery in just saying, I am going to do this and I'm going to suck at first. And that's
Yes,
okay.
exactly.
It's hard. It's hard to suck.
It really is, and what is that? I think there's something particularly about women, about being this type A perfectionist people pleaser, that it was the first time in my life where I gave myself permission to be really bad at something. And then, of course, there's these milestones of okay, am I going to allow anybody to read this really bad thing? But without reading it, you can't get better. Without sharing it, people can't give you input. So there's, about 100 points of bravery along the process of writing your first book. And then that's really just the beginning.
When you sit down to write, does it usually come to you with a character or a line of dialogue, or do you then plot it out, or do you just let it keep coming?
I found every book and every process to be different. I am not a plotter at all. I think I've incorporated some elements of plotting as I've done more writing. but I wouldn't consider myself a plotter. I think I let myself sort of discover who the characters are to start out. And sometimes the inspiration is the very first line of dialogue. Sometimes the inspiration is a relationship I want to explore. Sometimes a hook. Sometimes there's some like weird inspiration that makes me curious. Like, okay, what's going on with these people? I've had some inspiration from a song. And I thought, okay, here's the situation. What brought them here? And I need to write it. So it completely varies, I think, for each book. And my level of plotting varies. I think now I'm sort of, I just finished my eighth. And so now I have like a little bit more of a rhythm where I know I have to know enough to kind of get in there to explore, but I can't know everything. And this is what I learned in writing my first book, is that if I expected to know everything before I started, I would get this paralysis that wouldn't allow me to start. So I have to trust myself to go, I'm going to figure it out. And there always comes a point, every book I write, I'm like, am I really going to figure it out? Are the answers going to come to me? But I always do. And so at this point, I think it took like 3 or 4 books before I realized, okay, I know there's something that's intuitive about writing through pantsing that is really joyful for me versus plotting it all out and then just, it would almost feel like doing and redoing for me.
Mm-hmm.
Very much. I like the thrill of discovery and drafting. That being said, I have to see far enough out to keep going. So if I don't let my mind wander and explore about what's going to happen, sometimes at the midpoint or oftentimes at like the third act, I need to know what the crisis, the implosion is going to be in order to know that there's going to be enough tension, conflict, intrigue to drive the entire plot. And I also need to know, what really is the driving, it's like the engine of the story. I rarely know how it's going to end. I tend to always write happily ever after because I just need that for me, but I don't know how it's going to resolve. Sometimes I put the latest book, I just finished a draft. I had no idea how I was going to fix it. And I didn't know how it was going to resolve. I knew what the major challenge was going to be in the third act. And once I got there and I wrote it, I couldn't put the book down because I felt so bad for my characters leaving them there because I had no idea how I was going to get them out of the jam. So I trust myself not to know how I'm going to resolve it. The end is always really easy for me once I'm in there and I know the characters it's almost like it's an out of body experience writing the end, but the middle is tough unless I know what's going to fall apart.
Mm-hmm.
So and then, I do a lot of, as I go, I'll do like beat sheets and note taking about what happens next so I don't lose it if it comes in my head. I'll know where it's going. And by the time I get to probably the third act, I know what's going to happen and I have an outline, but I don't force myself. In fact, it would be really, it would sort of deaden my creativity to write out an entire outline. So that's just me, but I don't think I'm a full pantser because I do kind of like allow myself to explore what's coming next, write it down, don't forget it, start to draft an outline that becomes a little more clear as I go.
So you're like a hybrid,
Yeah,
a
yeah. And also
plantser.
yeah. And I feel like every book is so different. It's like, it's
Mm-hmm.
like parenting. I have several children and every child takes a different approach. And so I feel like each book and each set of characters is very different. And I find I don't force myself into like, this is the way I need to do it. I'm very freeform, I think, in my writing process, my writing style. And that's sort of how I am as a parent too. It's like whatever the kid needs, parent how the child needs. It's sort of like that, like write how the book needs to be written.
Do you find that it's always around the same point where you're like, can I really write a book? Or is it different every time?
It's different every time. That's the worst part. I wish it was the same time because then I would like write myself a note, like you always get here. I'd say the middle is always kind of hard, or sometimes I've written myself into a bind where I have the hook and I have sort of the catalyst, but I don't know what the plot is going to be. Like, okay, once do they get to the catalyst? What is going to be the plot? Which is silly. That was my like my biggest barrier when I wrote my first few books. And I think now I need to know. I I need to know some element of like what is going to be like the actual activities through the center of the book that gets them
Right.
to the implosion versus just sort of the hook or what's the major turning point. I need to know like what's going to happen because that's a big part. Obviously, you need to write the plot. But I would say that sometimes gets me into a bind because I have these characters, I have a hook, but then it's like, okay, what's going to happen and carry 300 pages.
Hmm.
So that tends to be some sticking point for me. I know that that's always tricky. So yeah, but sometimes it's the very beginning. Like I have these characters and I know what's going to happen, but how do I get them there?
Hmm.
And so this last year, I had a really sort of interesting writing year where I started and stopped 3 different books. And I had this feeling of like, oh no, what am I going to do? Do I know how to
Uh,
write again? And it wasn't until I got the right idea and I started a fourth one where again, it like flowed out in like 4 months. Um, so
was it?
I'm
It wasn't.
allowing,
It wasn't any of those 3 books.
no, mm-mm.
What happened
I
to
still
them?
have those. Those sad books are sitting in a file of other ideas. It's a discarded 80,000 words between the three of them. And I go back. Sometimes I'll do that. With my sixth and seventh, I started one and I got to a point and I'm like, I'm not feeling it. And so I abandoned it. I really loved the idea but the characters weren't right in the idea. And so I
Hmm.
set it aside. I had another idea. I wrote a full book. And then I came back to it and realized I needed to switch the characters. Like the main POV character, I needed to move her out into sort of um, the other. It was somebody who was a native to a particular town and somebody who was coming in as a visitor, and I just needed to swap them for it to work. Um, and so I did that, and then I wrote it quickly. So I might go back to them. The other challenge I have sometimes is I don't know what genre. Like a character may speak to me, but I'm like I don't know what genre that's going to be. I have an idea right now that I wrote about 10,000 words, and I'm like, what genre is this? And so do I invest a lot of time knowing that it may not be a book that anybody, there's any like demographic of people. They're like, I'm looking for that book. I don't know.
Yeah.
Um, so so that was a tough experience though, having three in a row where I'm like, I'm not
Yeah.
breaking through.
What genre
I
do
just
you
need
mainly write in?
that is a great question.
That's one I ask myself all the time.
I thought my first few books, I guess women's fiction is the best way to describe it. I would say, I tend to explore a lot of issues affecting women and families and dynamic, like, human fiction, but for some reason we relegate it to women's fiction.
Right.
Um, but I'm always really fascinated by the love story component, and so I would say some of my books lean more romance, and some of them lean a little bit more women's fiction. It's just the balance of, as people, life happens, lots of stuff happens. Sometimes the focus is, your relationship and your partner, and sometimes the focus is everything else. So I always have a love story or a few or, several running through my books, but I would say the balance of, what the focus is varies depending on the book and depending on like what my life looks like at the time and like what I'm curious about and maybe what answers I need to find in stories. So, but it will be published. Technically, it's women's fiction. And
So
though,
your
yeah.
debut novel will be women's fiction,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
that comes out
This
soonish,
summer.
right? This
Yeah,
summer?
this summer. Yeah, I don't have a final date, but June, July. Yeah, super
That's
excited.
amazing. So,
Yeah,
how did you get your agent? Was it with this book or was with it one of the previous books?
that is another great question. My pathway has been so weird. So, like I said, I just finished my eighth, and I didn't query all of them though. I kind of, because I was writing so quickly, I queried my second, but I really chickened out really early on that. I queried about 20 agents and I'm like, no. And I think my gut told me like, it just wasn't ready. And so I queried my agent who ultimately turned out to be my agent with that book. Didn't hear back. It was like an automatic pass. But she was always top of my list. And then by the time I sort of finished that query journey, I was very tentative. I would like write a query, send out two, wait to hear back. And you just can't do that because it might take 6 months. You may never hear back. Like you just kind of have to like get into a rhythm, but I didn't know that at the time. So it took me a year until I finally was like, okay, that book is shelved. By the time that happened, I was then on book 5. And so I queried my book 5, and that was the one that I really thought, like, this is going to be the book. Like, I'd written 5 books. I kind of figured out by that point, okay, this is my voice. This is what I want to say. This is kind of where my niche is going to be. And I was convinced it was my book. And my people, I have such a supportive family. Like they're absolutely amazing. My sisters, my husband, my daughter, like they all read my books and encourage me. And, they all thought, okay, this is going to be the book. So sure. So I queried it really widely. And I think I got a full request with my current agent, and it was I had a lot of full requests. So I thought, like, this is going to be the one. And ultimately, it wasn't. And my current agent said, I love your voice, love this book, but I don't know, I don't know what genre it is. It's sort of women's fiction, sort of romance. Again, this is like the theme that I
Right.
hear. She's like, so I think I have to pass. And by that point, I still had probably, I don't know, 5, 6 fulls still out, but I'd written another book. So I started querying that one, and that's the one that got me the agent. It was my book 6, and I ended up with a couple of offers on that one, but I went with the agent that I am with now. She's amazing. It was more classically, I think that book was more classically romance versus sort of straddling the line. Um, and ended up, we went on sub and got some good feedback right away. And ultimately, the editor who chose it said, I really like this, but I'm not entirely sure whether it's women's fiction or romance. It's like,
Oh, the
and this
story
was,
of your life.
it's the story of my life, because I'm always writing from a perspective of, we are women. We have everything going on all at once, all the time. You're juggling, sometimes kids or, helping your parents or family or friends and a relationship and a dog usually too. And so she said, but I saw on her website that she has other books. I'd love to see what else she's written to see where we might put her. And so I sent my book 5, the one that I was convinced is going to be my book. So I sent that one because I'd polished it and it was really ready. And they ultimately ended up buying that one.
That's so amazing.
So weird. And not my book 6. And so, yeah, I got my agent with book 6, but we ended up, selling book 5 in a
That's
2 book deal.
wild.
It was so weird. And it was such, I'm excited. I kind of thought this is going to be the book. But I think, my challenge is just finding that clear market genre. But now I'm in an imprint that's very women's fiction, but it also flows a bunch of different ways. So I think it's kind of my perfect home.
That's
Um,
great.
yeah, because I really love to explore everything that we go through in life all at once, all the drama, but also have always been really drawn to exploring relationships. And I think, I think of myself as a romance author because I do follow a lot of genre conventions, and also like firmly believe in an HEA because that's the contract I want when I read most of the time. I
Hmm.
read widely, but I do, that comfort, especially, life is hard. Life is so hard.
Hmm.
So when I read, I don't, I want to be prepared to be absolutely heartbroken if that's what's going to happen. So I do really appreciate that contract. I just tend to, take a few turns, I guess, before getting there.
Hmm. Do you think the hang up about where your genre fits, do you think it's more plot based or do you think it's more voice based?
I think it's more voice based. Um, would be my guess. I'd be interested to hear what folks who have read it say. But I tend to I'm drawn to write single POV, not always, but so it's usually from the female main character's perspective. So I think that happens a lot in romance, but I think that definitely contributes to it because I don't typically write a male POV. And then I think the voice is usually it's the voice of a woman going through and thinking through a lot of things all at once. And but I think plot wise, my debut I could explain it with all the tropes. There's it's almost a second chance because it's a former best friend turn enemies to lovers road trip, forced proximity.
Yes.
There's an only one bed. There's a lot of like the particular tropes. And that is, one point of feedback I received with an editor actually is that, and this was on a different book that's not being published, was, this has a lot of the rom-com tropes, but with a women's fiction voice, because I think I tend to be right in a very, I think the emotionality is pretty rich, I would say. And so I think it's more that where a lot of the plot driven elements are very much romance, but there's a lot more going on in a particular
Hmm.
woman's head, and that's what I like to read. Like that's why I get a little confused because most of the books that I would say are like that are marketed as romance.
Yeah, like Emily Henry, Carly
Yeah,
Fortune.
yeah, yeah. Kate Claiborne, Abby Jimenez, this like deep interiority. Kennedy Ryan does that really
Hmm.
like beautifully as well. And so I think that's in large part what I was inspired by, and it's what I write. And so when people said this isn't romance, I'm like, really? I'm confused. But it's also really interesting the fact that I got picked up by more of a book club women's fiction imprint this last book I finished. It gave me some freedom to maybe lean in more toward the other messy parts of my character's
Hmm.
life in a way that was sort of liberating. My heart is always in romance, but it did really help me break through those three abandoned novels and start a fourth that became like really richly. I think it's probably my most women's fiction book, but of course there's a love story and a contract with an HEA. But yeah, but it's the story of my life. It's always like, what genre is this? I don't know. Just tell me. I don't. Yeah,
It's a book that I
but
wrote.
yeah, yeah. I can guarantee you, there's a lot of romance in it. A friend of mine described because somebody asked me, and I'm like, I don't know. And so she told the person who asked, she's like, she writes women's fiction with spice. I'm like, okay, that's one way to put it.
Good way to put it.
Yeah.
I would read that. Do you have a favorite book that inspires you?
Goodness, there's so many on any given week. I think I devour books. It's been harder this year as I've been trying to edit one book, finish book two. I just turned in book two this week.
That's so exciting.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's super exciting. I turned it in. I'd been done with it, but yeah, just did the last minute perfectionist polishing, like printed it out, made sure every comma was in the right place, all of those things, and of course found things I wanted to change. But yeah, I was able to turn it in this week, which is really cool. I would say there isn't a book. I think there's books and moments in time that really hit you at a particular moment and sort of change how you think about writing, reading, about the world, about what you want to consume, and I think the dialogue I want to contribute to. So I would say so many. Of course, like books that I read growing up, but probably not going there. But as far as like once I started really diving into romance genre and women's fiction, there's a couple of like books in time that sort of changed how I thought about writing. And this is an oldie, like sort of classic in the last 10 years is The Hating Game. I think that really switched something for me about I think one of the things stopping me from like trying a book was I thought I had to have this, it is the advice you're given, an amazing hook to start, right? But that was sort of intimidating to me to think about this like a monumental hook. And if I didn't have it, I couldn't start writing.
Hmm.
And The Hating Game is like perfect. There's definitely a hook. But I met Sally Throne years ago, and I just said, your book, there was something about it because it's so voice driven. It's just like this fabulous voice through it that it gave me the confidence to just try and see if I could like figure out a plot based on voice. And I met her at a signing and I said that, and she kind of laughed. She's like, yeah, who would have thought that, a book would sell with an entire scene where they're watching a rerun of ER, which is so true. And so that kind of flipped something for me. I would not say that my writing is similar at all, but there was something about that book that kind of triggered something in me about how powerful just like a really strong voice can be. And then I would say Kate Claiborne, like Luck of the Draw, also did a real shift for me around character and the balance of interiority and plot. Um, and then, I'm going to miss so many, but, Beach Read as well. I just absolutely love that book. And again, it was another one that sort of just switched something for me about dialogue. Probably is a big like lesson I drew from that. Abby Jimenez, I've read all of her books, but there was something about A Part of Your World, which I don't hear people talking about quite as much. She's had such big
Hmm.
traction, but A Part of Your World was just lovely. I think really about the depth of the emotions between the two characters, and like the third act was so heart-wrenching that it really like it's almost like giving permission to really show the emotions on the page. And another one that Kennedy Ryan's Before I Let Go. Just so beautiful. I don't know if you've read it, but it's absolutely gorgeous. And the power again of treating something that was very, very emotional without feeling like it was exploiting the emotions, but also just really doing it with grace and compassion. And so there's so many more. I'm sure I've missed a billion books that I absolutely love. And another one, Alicia Thompson's books, I think more recently, I love that balance of like humor and heartache.
Hmm.
That's kind of, you could probably tell from some of the books that I've mentioned, have really just like how those two things coexist, because I think that's life, right? And to capture that in one page is really powerful. So just, I think just at key moments, sort of the books I needed to help me think about writing in a different way. But
Hmm.
there's so many more. I'm sure I'm going to get off of this call and be like, oh, but this one is my favorite of all time.
How many books do you think it took you to find your voice? Did you have it from the get-go?
No. Well, interesting. I think voice as I received, because my query process has always been, it was rough, right? It was I amassed a lot of rejections on my way, and continually I would get, I love your voice, but, and it was usually loved my voice, but the hook wasn't strong enough. That's what I hear.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably the number one point of feedback I'd given, which is funny because what gave me permission to write was like thinking, okay, let me set the hook aside
Right.
and just write and write to voice. So I think voice was probably the thing that was somewhat easiest for me, but I needed to layer on. It's not just about voice, it's also about, building the dialogue or the balance of emotionality and the pacing and all of that. So I think voice may be the thing that was easiest and easiest to hone. It was all the other parts of craft that um, were harder. And it took me probably until book 5 to sort of figure it out, which is coincidentally going to be my debut. I think I can go back to some of my earlier books and rewrite them, but I probably need to pull them apart
Mm-hmm.
for all of those things. Like, was there the right balance? Was it the right pacing? Was it all of that?
Mm-hmm. How did you learn all of that then? Did you take classes or was it by doing? Is there a craft book that you taught you a lot? Was it all of it?
It was all of it. I think for the most part, like I had to, in order to start, I had to not look at any of that to start with. Because again, the type A, wanting to learn everything, do everything, if I read a craft book before I started writing, I've read several since, but that first book, I had to just jump off the cliff and start writing to prove to myself that I could actually do it. To prove to myself that I could write the end and go, okay, it's not great, but I did it. I did this thing. I wrote a book. And so it wasn't until I think I'd written my first 2 that I started going, okay, I have a lot to learn. And I had this wonderful like mentor of mine who, a friend of a friend, actually a friend of my sister's, and my sister read my first book and said, this is so good. And I knew nothing. I didn't know about agents. I knew nothing. This was many, many years ago. And I didn't know where to go for any help. And my sister said, okay, well, why don't I pass it to Kevin? And Kevin is a friend of hers who, an amazing writer. He's a memoirist. He just passed actually this fall, and just one of life's amazing, great people. And he had a weekly column. I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area. I had a weekly column in the Chronicle in San Francisco where he wrote about his life, and beautiful writer, like the type of writer that you read, I think it's like 1,000 words and you just like are always tearing up. There's something like so
Mm-hmm.
beautiful about the kindness with which he wrote. And I said, no, 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 you can't do that. You cannot send my book to Kevin. She's like, let me just ask him. I'm like, no, 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 no. We cannot like bore him with this. And I'm embarrassed. And she's like, no, 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 I'm going to do it. So she did it against my will.
Oh, friends.
And yeah. And so he emailed me and he said, okay, print out your book, send me a printed copy. It'll take me a long time because I work with pen and paper, but I will read it and I will give you notes. And this man, like, I can't even, so a few months later, he called me, he said, I'm ready. And we met at a coffee shop and he had a 10-page editorial letter for me and had marked up every single page with red pen and sat with me with, I can't even explain the level of kindness and patience and love with which he went through. This is my first book. It will never see the light of day. Like, I won't even rewrite it. I mean, I have rewritten it several times, but now knowing what I know, it was objectively not good. But he sat down with me anyway. It was like 3 hours and he walked me through and he basically taught me how to write. And he said, your voice is beautiful. Now you need stakes. Basically, you need plot. And his biggest thing is like, kill all these adverbs. Kill them. I don't want to see another word. And he was with so much like humor and levity and love, he basically taught me how to write. He's like, go back with this editorial letter, rewrite it. And I did. And I rewrote it and he read it again. And he's like, this is so much better. And I will forever. So he was, I would say, my first like teacher, other than obviously, writing teachers I've had across the years. But there's something very different with somebody going through an entire novel and taking the patience to edit and mark it up. And he did the same with my second book. And basically was like, you've improved leaps and bounds. And I credit him because if he had come in without telling me what I did right, because he did a lot of like, this is what you did right. I wouldn't have had the confidence to revise and keep going. But because he said, this is good. You have all of this down. Here's what you need to add. Here's what you need to shift. It gave me the confidence to keep going. And we just had his service this fall, and my husband told me a story that I didn't know. We went to, every year they had this like amazing Christmas party in their house, and there was a tradition of you take an ornament, leave an ornament. So their Christmas trees at the front, you can just take anything off their tree and add one. So there's like this
That's so cool.
communal, isn't that cool? That's just, it says so much about him. And he pulled my husband aside and he said, whatever you do, support her. She's going to be an author. And I didn't know that he had said that. But anyway, so I think I needed that like individual confidence that like, okay, you maybe you suck, but you don't suck that bad. And you don't suck so bad that you're not going to improve. And he never said any unkind word, but he did tease me about some of the things I got wrong that I will never get wrong again because he teased me about it in such a loving way. So yeah, so that was, I think, the biggest point of transition for me. And then he said, soon you're going to have writing friends. There'll be classes. I'm like, well, how do I get writing friends? He's like, you will, don't worry. And I think about that all the time as I'm like texting, my friends and other authors about like publishing woes or wins or excitement, or I'm stuck on this plot point. And I'm like, how did I get here? And how did I become so lucky to have these writing friends? And I think about how prophetic it was when he said, you will, just like all the confidence in the world. Like, and I think he knows because he was a writer, like writers are generous, accepting, loving people. If you put yourself out there, there will be a community for you. So that was really, I think, what I leaned on a lot. And then I started taking a lot of classes. I did Stanford Continuing Studies and the deep dive from, the shit no one tells you about writing. So some classes there and some particular authors, doing like one-time classes. I think it was with the pandemic, like having that openness to everything being on Zoom. And I've taken, workshops and gone to conferences, and I really dove into a lot of things and have read craft books and publishing books. But it wasn't until I had the confidence of like, okay, I can actually finish something, that I was willing to learn like what I didn't know and what I've gotten wrong, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot
It's
of
just
sense.
a different style.
So you mentioned your writing community and finding those writing friends. How did you do it? Like he knew you were
Yeah.
going to do it, but then how did you find those people?
I think classes and workshops. And so I mentioned a Stanford continuing study class I did, and that was on querying. And so we had a small group where they broke us out, and it turned out one of the women happened to be local to me. And so we met up for lunch, and then she's read all of my books and she's given me feedback, and I've read hers, and we do a lot of query feedback. And then as well as there was the shit no one tells you about writing, I did a beta reader matchup, and I've been meeting with the same group for, I want to say, just over 2 years now, where it was supposed to be the first 3,000 words and we kind of hit it off. And the four of us have been continuing to meet once a month. And we kind of set our own rules. We end up giving each other 50 pages every month. And we do a round of like verbal feedback and then give each other marked up pages coming back. And so at this point, they've read, I want to say 3.5 of my books. And then I also did the deep dive workshop, and independently, one of the writers is like, I want to gather all the people writing romance and pull this into a WhatsApp group. It just sort of spiraled from there. I think out of that group, many of us tried to do Smooch Pit. And so we gave each other feedback on our first 10 pages. And we've had a lot of success out of that group. We had four of us who got agents within, I would say, 2, 3 months of each other.
Wow, that's cool.
And we're all on submission together. And so we've been a huge support to each other about everything. And luckily, we're sort of scattered. I think I have one good friend of mine who's local, and so we'll meet at, book signings and everything in the Bay Area, and we've met up quite a few times. The other two are scattered, DC and Chicago, but somehow managed to meet still. So, and then finally, my agent, they've self-organized a Slack for all of the clients. So, because there are a lot of women's fiction, thriller, romance, and there are about 30 of us on a Slack channel where we, again, publishing wins and woes. And now I don't know, many of the people that sort of, I started with a writing connection. It's amazing how worldviews are very similar among folks who are trying to do this for a living, and many of them have become dear friends. So who I can, call and say, hey, can you read this for me? And I've never heard a no, so I never say no, which is sometimes gets me into trouble, but because I do a lot of beta reads for friends. And then, yeah, also just become friends about other things too, sharing photos of kids and vacations and lamenting when things go wrong. And so, yeah, it was, I think, a lot of just putting yourself out there. I think that's the biggest thing, is just being willing to get out in community and share your words. And there's such a vulnerability to that I think we all sort of see that in each other, that willingness to put yourself out there.
So you wrote quite a few books before you signed with your agent.
Yeah.
Did you ever consider self-publishing, or did you always know you wanted to go the traditional route?
I always knew I wanted to go the traditional route, and I think not that I would be against it at some point if things shift. I think for a couple of reasons. One of them being, I always know how much better my books get with community and with multiple eyes on them. And I'm not precious about my words. I want them to be as good as they can possibly be. So I love obviously when you're self-publishing, you hire editors, you still have a group of community and can have beta readers, but I'm definitely like a gold star type of person where I want the seal of approval from somebody who's like, I guess the gatekeepers are always hard in publishing, but I'm always like, okay, if I get through the gatekeepers, I have a little bit more, I don't know, like a report card or something that we
Right.
all miss. So that was part of it. And also just being in community with other authors, and finally just like, I'm busy. I have a pretty demanding full-time job. I have, as I said, multiple children, a needy dog, a husband, family, friends. And I wouldn't say my strength is in selling myself. Like I'm not going to be like a social media influencer. I can't see that. Obviously, as a writer, you have to be out there. And but the level at which I think I could sort of wrap my arms around all the things self-pub authors do, which is amazing. I sat through this class with this amazing, I wish I could remember what her name was. She's highly, highly successful. It's just not in a genre I read. So it's blanking on me. And it was a couple of years ago, but I sat through this class of like what she did as a self-published author. I'm like, wow, she is amazing. But it takes a certain type of, I think, the person who loves that type of hustle to do it well and to be successful at it. And I'm not a saleswoman. Like it's just not something that, or like maintaining, maintain multiple communities of folks online and keeping the rhythm going of even just the pulse point of like what people want to read. I mean, she was amazing and eye-opening, and I thought, I don't think that's the pathway for me. I was tired. I was very, very tired after listening to her. You are impressive, and I am
I need a nap.
so glad that worked for you. I need a nap. Yeah, it was pretty cool, but it was really eye-opening. And again, like publishing traditional route, there's still so much hustle, but the way I want to be like out there and visible, I think is not to the extent that a lot of self-pub authors have to do to be successful.
It's just important to be that self-aware, to make those choices,
Yeah.
How do you know when one of your books is done?
Oh, I don't. I don't know. Is it? I don't know. That's such a good question. I think Done is such an interesting word in writing because I tend to write in order most of the time, not always. So, I get to and type the end. That's when I feel like, okay, it's a book like thing. But then I usually take a break, and a week later I'm in revising and revising and revising, and I send out to beta readers and do a lot of revisions. I would say my pace, because I tend to draft and edit all at the same time. Like I'll start drafting something while I have another book out at with beta readers or with my editor or whatever, the timing is. I'm always circling back. Um, so I guess, ask me again in a year, there will be a book out there that people can buy, and I'm going to have to say that one is done. Um, but I have, the book, my debut, which has a new title. So The Truth is in the Detours, which that is now its 10th title, at least probably. I wrote it in 2021, the first draft. And it's gone through so many different revisions. And I just, I finished my developmental edits maybe 2 months ago. And I'm like, wow, is this it? But it's going to come back to me in copy edits. I haven't done copy edits yet. But I would say like the bulk of it, it's sort of like turning off a tap, right? Like when I'm drafting, it's like it's flowing out, but it's sort of a broken tap, and I close it and there's still a drip. And sometimes the characters are still talking to me for up to a year before I feel like, okay, this is good enough to go out. But I don't ever feel like anything's perfect or fully done. And I don't think I'm going to feel that way until I see it in print. And even then, I'll probably be like, oh, what about this? So I don't know. I don't know. I guess when, I don't have, I don't have the physical option to go and revise.
Right.
Yeah, which is going to be interesting. That'll be yeah, relinquishing control.
So you have a book, you send it off to beta readers, you wait for their feedback, but you're always drafting, which is amazing, and I'm always drafting. But then I have the trouble of like, do you just carry on with the draft until that draft is done and then go back and revise the other one that you sent out for feedback? Or do you kind of hop back and forth? Do you work on multiple things at a time?
I hop back and forth. I wouldn't suggest that that's a good idea for people, but I do. I think partially because if I get feedback, I can't, it's in my head and I can't rest until I either fix it or decide, you know what, and that's one thing I'm getting better at as I write, as I used to when my first, I would incorporate everybody's feedback. And I'd wind up with like a Frankenstein monster. And I'm like, I'm not sure that I like this anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm now like better at, okay, I can't accept that feedback. It'll change. Like it'll no longer be the book I want to write. But once I get feedback, I'm unsettled until I go through it and make that determination. So if I'm like really, really on a roll and about to finish a book and sort of in that, really like crazed drafting stage, sometimes I'll read the feedback and go, okay, I'll deal with that later. But I often bounce back and forth, and I might take like a weekend break on a drafting project in order to incorporate the feedback and like send it off to another beta reader or do it and set it aside for me to like read and polish later. And sometimes it's multiple books. Like right now, I was doing, dev edits on my debut at the same time I was preparing my book two. Because I finished book two like a little over a year ago. It's one that I had in the drawer too. And just like getting it ready and sending that out to some beta readers to do a final polish before turning it in for book two as I was drafting this like current book so I was doing all of that at once. I think those are the only three I was working on. So yeah, I tend to juggle several. And the only time I've gotten into trouble, my sister was reading, and my sister is somebody that reads like every single draft and multiple times, always. Like she'll demand. I think sometimes she thinks she's like my agent because she demands pages from me. She's like, "Where are those pages you promised me?" I'm like, my own agent doesn't do that. Like, but there was a inserted the wrong like character's name because I was working on multiple books. She's like, what is Caleb doing here? I'm like, I don't know. He doesn't belong in that book. So I'm glad I have people that catch that level of thing. Like, I don't know why Caleb is in this.
You just want to pop in and say hi.
Yeah, you can lie and say it's some Easter egg, but yeah, he's totally in the wrong book. I've never done that before. I think it was a lot like managing a lot of different characters and books and threads.
Yeah. Was book two So book two that's going to be published, was book two book six, or was it a
No,
different one in the
no,
drawer?
it's a different one. Book seven. So my poor book six.
And poor book six is just hanging out.
Orbit six. Yeah, it's we'll see. We'll see. It may come back to life. I don't know. Like have a huge attachment to it. It's probably my lightest book. I tend to write a lot of heavy themes. I say that and then like I'm thinking about the themes that are in there. I'm like, oh, it's pretty heavy. But it's a fun, it's yeah, I don't know what's going to happen to it. I think it's interesting because it's what got me my editor. She's like, I like this, but it wasn't quite right for either imprint. And so we'll see. I could also revise it. I'm not particularly, like, I'm always willing to revise if it'll make something stronger and like become a different book. I think I'm waiting. I'm sitting on that one to think if I have a big idea to make sure it's more, I think, women's fiction versus this, like, straddling the line. And I'll
Mm-hmm.
see if I can sort of rework it. But yeah, book six sort of shelved for now. And then book seven, I had finished, I think right before I'd finished the first draft, right before I got my agent. And yeah, have been like revising. So very slowly because I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing with this book, but I was revising in beta readers and stuff. And so when I talked to my editor about book two, that was the one we leaned it on. So I'm super excited about it. It's turned in. So we'll
That's so
see.
exciting. The first book that you queried, and you only queried like 20 agents. Was that a hard book to let go of? Because it seems like, and maybe it's because now you have experience and you have so many books under your belt, and you have two that are like in the works of getting published. It seems like you're kind of easy breezy. It's okay if they're in the drawer.
No. Oh, yeah, I mean, book two, it's fine. I mean, it's fine. Like I think the more books I have, the less maybe attached I get to some of the early ones. What's interesting is I really thought my book five, which is my debut, I thought that one was dead because I had queried so broadly. I just thought it was dead and I was really upset about that. And when I spoke to my agent during the call, I'm like, you read this book five. Do you think I could revise it? And she's like, yeah, I think so. And so, that one I was really still attached to. I had a really hard time and it was over a year ago when I let it go. And I had with my writing friends, I'm like, I think I have to shelve this book. I don't want to shelve this book. So that one was really hard. I would say the book two the first book that I queried, I was sad. But by that point, I'd written three more books. So I was sort of like, okay, I'm ready to move on. And I sort of had my pick of three of these three. Which one do I think is most marketable and easiest to query, really? Because again,
Mm-hmm.
my problem is like the hook. And my book five has a hook that I think is pretty compelling. Like that's what came to me first. It was the first book where I was like, I know what the major thing is going to be to summarize it in a sentence.
Mm-hmm.
But book two, I probably would never revisit it, partially because um, it's too enmeshed in my day job anyway, where I think it could be a
Mm-hmm.
little complicated, where it's probably best that it stays in the drawer.
Yeah.
Probably wasn't a very wise decision to write it in the first place, and so it's fine. That one will stay in the drawer. Um, and the others, I don't know. Like I have a book four that I really, really love. It's a tougher one. It's super long. It's the type of book that they're like, don't write over. I mean, for romance, women's fiction, it's like well over 100,000 words.
Mm-hmm.
And it's three POVs, which is really tricky because differentiating. So I know there's a lot of editing to do on that one, like deep editing, like clarifying voices, I think, for each of the characters. It's three sisters, which is hard because
Mm-hmm.
to differentiate them when I know me, I have two sisters and we all sound alike. And so you want to like make them sound different, but it's also hard when they're so closely related and they have all the same memories. So that one I hope someday to revive. But I would say my first three, I am like completely at peace with having them bend my training wheels. And like did something remarkable for me, but they don't need to be read by other people.
Are you working on anything new right now?
No, I just finished the first draft of like my book eight, and so I'm polishing, editing, tearing it apart right now, but I'm not drafting. I think for the first time, partially from what I learned last year, I think when I started and stopped three different books, I realized I'd been going so quickly for so many years that last year, I think I just needed a break. I think I needed to just let
Hmm.
my creativity sort of take a breather. And so I'm listening to those cues now, and I'm not like forcing myself to start something new. I'm sure in a month or two, I'm gonna need to start something new. But for now, I'm kind of reading, refilling the well, trying to take a breather, knowing that I have copy edits and dev edits coming, and I want to get this book 8 ready for my option book or something.
Hmm.
But it'll probably, I don't know, probably by January, I'm gonna be itching to start something new.
Well, that's very exciting. This has been so great. Do you have
Great.
anything else that you would like to share?
I just think for those, like, I think that the purpose of this is so I wrote a book. Now what? I think there's just not one way, you know? It's kind of like, I mean, the biggest thing now what is just be brave, I think, and be open and be curious. And um, I think there's, one of the things I've learned, one of the hardest things is knowing what feedback to take and what feedback that maybe isn't for you. And being comfortable with, no book is for everybody. So find the people it is for and be okay with being imperfect. And I think, there's a lot of like, it's in many ways such an opaque industry, and also an industry so like filled to the brim with folks that are open and eager to help and share their wisdom. And so just finding the people who are willing to share it with you. Like I shared, my experience with my mentor. His name is Kevin Fisher Paulson, who was so open and so helpful and so pivotal. And so finding those people and being okay, just like with not being good at first, that it's worth it to push through and to get better. And obviously there's a lot of like practical guides. There's so many resources, but it's also just finding, I think what I needed to find is the resources that would be gentle enough that I would continue to want to be better and not feel like there's so much rejection in this industry. There's so much. So you have to brace yourself for it, and you have to find your confidence and your joy somewhere. And, filling your well with that, I think is helpful to like for the perseverance to keep going.
Hmm. So true. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank
Hearing
you.
your
This was
story is so
fun.
inspiring. Like, it's wild.
I feel like everybody's publishing story is so varied and different and wild.
It's
And
true.
yeah, yeah, they're all
Yeah.
different. They're all different.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they all end up as like books on the shelf, but they all got there in such different ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
Well, thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much for being here. Now go write.